main focus of this slideshow will be on the history of Eastern and Southern Africa, and it's a very, very long history because this is the area where the earliest humans were. As I said before, the Earth's first people, we believe, were here. Scientists believe that the first people were in this region. People lived in this region about 2.5 to 2 million years ago. We have found fossils from them of Homo erectus, some of the very first steps towards evolution of human. You can kind of see the first humans down here and what we think they may have looked at like based on fossils. Fossils are remains of ancient humans and animals. Okay, and so that is your definition of fossils, and they get trapped down in the earth and preserved for us to be able to see. Now, the very first ones from 2.5 million years ago were found in Ethiopia and Tanzania. Both of these countries are in that Eastern Africa region. And so what we need to figure out is, what were these first humans actually like? What did they do? What was important to them? All that kind of stuff. Now, obviously, the most important thing at that time was simply survival. Okay, closer to animals than what we are today. And so of course, they wanted to live where they had less development. They didn't have heaters and air conditioners and all that kind of different stuff. So they wanted to live in warm places where it was easy to survive, because the easiest parts to survive are places that are not freezing cold and not super hot and not have water. And so they wanted to live in these warm places. They also moved around to search for food. They were not farming yet. Farming didn't exist yet. They were not growing anything, just out looking for food. So whether they're hunting and trying to kill other animals to eat, or gathering and trying to find wild fruits and vegetables, that was kind of what they did. All right, and over time they started to spread out. So they started in Africa, and the first ones that we found are in Africa, in Ethiopia and Tanzania. But then as they wanted, or as more and more got there, or came to be, I guess, and there wasn't a food supply, they started to move out, and they moved to all the other places of the earth. And so the very first people that we all come from started in Ethiopia and Tanzania, according to many, many scientists. Okay, so we're going to fast forward a lot from the very first humans to the very first civilizations that we know of in this region, and we see that in 2000 BC, so over 4,000 years ago, Nubia grew into being a center of trade. And so Nubia is where Sudan is right now. It's a chunk of modern day Sudan, and one of their main ways that they grew and got bigger was to trade with the huge ancient civilization of ancient Egypt, right? And so they traded with ancient Egypt, and what happened with Egypt is Egypt brought in the skills that they had from being a huge civilization for a very long time, and the technology that they had, and they brought it down and shared the ideas and technology with the people of Nubia. And the most important of these was making iron. So if you make iron, you no longer have to deal with tools and weapons that are made out of essentially sticks and different kinds of stones that you can sharpen and things like that, right? And so now you have actual metal, iron tools and weapons, which gives you a leg up on anybody else who may just have those old primitive weapons, right? And so these things were also passed then from Nubia onto other parts of Africa, and this technology started to spread over the area at that time. Another civilization, early civilization, was Aksum, and Aksum was in modern day Ethiopia, so in that area where Ethiopia is right now. And it was at an area that was really a center for trade. It had a port on the Red Sea, meaning it had a city, it had an area right on the Red Sea, and so that allowed it to trade. That was a connection that it had with Africa, all of Africa, with Europe, with Asia, and so it allowed the Aksum civilization to trade with these two huge empires at the time of Rome and India, and that location allowed this civilization to become big and prosperous and rich. And so the other thing that happened is Rome and India at that time were actually Christian kingdom or Christian areas. And so at this time, those countries brought Christianity into Ethiopia, into Aksum, and it became a Christian kingdom. And the interesting thing is, Ethiopia is surrounded by a lot of Islamic countries, and it has remained a Christian country primarily throughout all of these years because of its history from the days of Aksum civilization. One of the earliest spreaders of civilization was this Bantu migration, and this came from the Bantu people who actually were from and started in West Africa. In that last set of notes that we did, we talked about the Bantu. And what happened is the Bantu in 500 AD grew really, really big. That a lot of people started to grow there, and because of their success, people had more kids, and they grew too big to fit and really support themselves in that West African area. And so many of them started to migrate, and they migrated across southern Africa. And so you can see down here on this map, right, in that first migration, the very initial migration, they just moved on along those red lines. And then there was later migrations where they spread out into all of South Africa, following those purple lines. And so when they grew really big, they did this because they were really successful. They had a lot of amazing things about their culture that other early civilizations in Africa didn't have. And so they had all these successful cultural traits, and they brought those things with them when they moved into these new areas. And so they brought their language with them, the Bantu language, which now there's an entire family of languages that are that come from this original Bantu language. Think of the Bantu language as like the trunk of the tree, and then the other languages are all the branches that come off of it. And they also brought with their farming methods. Okay, and again, farming, cultivating crops, that's what allows these civilizations to get big. Instead of just going out and looking for your food and getting enough food for you and your family, now you can plant food, you can plant the crops and grow your own food, and you can usually, when you do that, grow enough for yourself and for a whole bunch of other people that you can sell to. That way, now we can have cities, and now people can focus on something other than just staying alive, than just feeding themselves. The other thing that they did is they raised cattle, and so they brought along with them cows, and the whole point was to grow them up and then be able to eat them, use them for meat, and also their very strong knowledge of iron tools helped to spread those tools rather than, again, the sticks and stone tools of before. They could bring these iron tools in to use in their farming, as well as weapons, as I talked about before. Now, the largest trading city founded by the Bantu was Great Zimbabwe, okay, and that was founded in 1400 AD. All right, and so this was a very large trading city. Okay, the whole point of it was to trade, and they used their heavy resources of gold and ivory, and they took them out to Africa's east coast, and they took them to the ports, to the cities where the ships would come in, and they sold them and traded them for goods from Asia that then they could take back into Africa and sell back to the people who had mined the gold or hunted the animals to get the ivory. Take some time to write out your answer to this question. The question says, we have seen that the major early civilizations were centers of trade. Why do you think that trade was so important to the people of southern and eastern Africa? Another large spreader of culture was the Arab influence. And what happened is the Arab traders came in, and they came in from that area of Southeast Asia, okay? And they started to filter down, and they started to find these things, but they came by sea on ships, and they also came across the Sahara. And with them, they brought their goods to make money, and they wanted to get the resources from Africa to get back to the Arab lands. Okay, but they also brought pieces of their culture. They brought the Arabic language. They brought Islam with them. All right, and so these people started to settle in large numbers on the east coast of Africa, and especially on the island of Zanzibar. And I did a map over here so you kind of knew where Zanzibar is. Okay, but Zanzibar Island is a beautiful island off of the coast of Tanzania. All right, and this island became a major trading civilization, and it became really influenced by these Arab cultural influences. And so they had the largest trading network, including Europe and Asia, and of course Africa. Okay, and so you have three continents that you have access to, and a whole lot of ships were coming into and out of Zanzibar at this time. Mostly trading with places like countries on the Mediterranean Sea, with India, with Southeast Asia, where there were these large populations of people who wanted to trade for the goods that they had. And so Zanzibar became a cultural center for the Arabs. All right, and so they brought in all of these cultural changes, and so the Arabs had this very large and active slave trade, and so they took a slave trade that already existed in Africa and they expanded it to get bigger and bigger and bigger, because you can make even more money off of slaves than you could off of gold or ivory or anything else. And so they expanded out this slave trade. The other thing they brought in was the Arabic language. They brought in Islam as well, and then they founded some of these cities that are still large cities today. For example, Mogadishu was in Somalia, was a city that was founded by the Arab traders at this time. And now, inevitably, we have to talk about the Europeans who came in and put their footprint on this region. And so the first group to come into this region were the Portuguese. Portugal came in and started to trade with the region in about 1400 AD, and then started to really take control of places and take over places in about 1500 AD. And they were really their goal was to try to control trade and try and make as much money as they possibly can. And of course, to do that, they found very quickly that slaves were the most profitable thing to trade in. And so they also expanded the slave trade just like the Arabs did when they came in. All right. And so later on, outside of this money-making thing, they did start to set up colonies. People did start to actually move into the area. But these areas, these you know, I don't even know how to say it. So these ancient civilizations, these ancient people, and we're not even really too ancient. We're only that, 600 years ago. They were really vulnerable to the European empires that came in. Okay, and they were vulnerable to the European empires because this transatlantic slave trade that was happening on the west coast of Africa, that was happening to them too. They were getting taken, they were getting sold to the people who were bringing those slaves over across. Okay, and so if your enemy, what another African tribe or another African civilization, fought against you and captured your people, and then they went and sold them to people to become slaves for the rest of their lives, that would make you very angry. And so these ethnic groups started to have these little seeds of hate where they really started to hate each other and be angry at other ethnic groups. And that's because they were selling each other into slavery to try and make as much money as they could. All right, and so this, plus the constant warfare between these ethnicities, between these tribes, between these civilizations, whatever you want to call them, really weakened their society. And so in the late 1800s, the Europeans really came in and started to trade and conquer, and by the 1900s, the Europeans ruled most of Africa. You can see on this map over here, you got all that blue is from France. They had a lot of West and Central and a little bit of North Africa, but the region we're really talking about in the South and the East, really think about that East half, was really dominated by Britain. Okay, so all of that pink is Britain, and you can also see that Portuguese influence coming in. in those green countries. Towards the bottom, you see Belgium jumping in the middle, and also Italy jumping in on the east coast as one of the major colonizers. Some of the colonies at this time that were being set up by trading companies, and they were set up by trading companies as supply posts or outposts on the way to Asia. So these people were coming in and they were trying to get to Asia, and the best way to get to Asia was to go around the bottom of Africa. And so along the way, they needed to stop and resupply to get more food, to get whatever they needed to get their men over to Asia to be able to trade these things. And so they set up these supply posts where you could stop and think of it as almost like refuel. You could get more food, you could get more water, whatever you needed out there on the sea. All right, and so for those traveling to Asia, these were set up as supply posts. One of these companies that did it was the Dutch East India Trading Company. And so they set up a place called Cape Town in South Africa. And what happened is, it was this small town. It was intended to be just a supply town. And then some farmers came from different areas of Europe and started to settle there. And so they spread out to create this whole Cape Colony instead of just Cape Town. They came from Netherlands, France, and other European countries, and they were known as the Boers. And so you can see down here, the Boers, spelled a little weird, right? Okay, but it is a Dutch word. It comes from a Dutch word for farmers, and so these first people were known as the Boers. Okay, and then the Boers were in there having their own colony, doing their own thing, and then all of a sudden gold and diamonds were discovered. And as we know throughout history, we've learned before, when gold and diamonds are discovered, people are going to come and try and get those resources. People want those resources. And so many Europeans came down, and this colony got really big and powerful really fast. And then in 1795, the Dutch had this colony, but the British thought, ooh, that looks good. They have gold, they have diamonds, let's go in and take it. So they went in and attacked and took the colony from the Dutch people. Take some time to write out checkpoint 2. The question is, why do you think that these countries were easily influenced by other people like the Arabs and the Europeans? These European colonies had a negative impact and were hated by the Africans for a lot of different reasons, but they also had a positive impact on the area. And so we're going to look at those two lists, split down the middle right here. And so we can see on the left side, they were hated by the Africans for a lot of different reasons. The Europeans came in, they took over their land, not asking, just took it. Okay, and so obviously people are going to be upset about that. And so they hated that. They forced these Africans, they forced these local people to come in and build up the area, and they paid them very, very little amount of money or supplies, or sometimes no pay at all, and used them as slave labor. The other thing is the Europeans, the white people who had come down, had all of the power in the government. The Africans were not allowed any real power within the system. And the last one, the thing that is hated by the Africans and still exists today because of these old attitudes, is ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism, we have this definition of it right here, and this is ethnocentrism by Europeans, but it was in this scenario, Europeans believed that their culture was superior, was better than the other people. So basically that they were just better people than the other people that were there because of racial differences, religious differences, whatever it was. They just thought that they were the superior people. And this idea is one that would stick around for a long time and is still out there today. So obviously a big negative, and has caused a lot of the fights that we're going to see later on between different ethnicities. Now, the positives, the good things about being a European colony is the British very quickly realized that they thought slavery was a bad thing. And so they hit this a little bit earlier than a lot of other countries, and they realized we're just going to get rid of it. Okay, and so they did that, and then all of these different areas, we saw that the British had most of the colonies in this region. they got rid of the slave trade. Okay, they said you're a colony of Britain, slavery doesn't exist in Britain, so no go. You can't trade slaves anymore. Okay, the other thing they brought in was modern healthcare, so all of the newest technology for hospitals and doctors and things like that. The British knew about them, and so they brought them with them to take care of their own people, but of course, when they were doing that, they also took care of the people of Africa that were already living there. They built up other infrastructure besides just healthcare. They built up roads and transportation and all that kind of stuff that we had talked about before. And they also added more access to education. And so they started to allow women to get educated a little bit more. They started to have more schools as they're building up this infrastructure. And so these African people had way more access to education than they ever had. And so at this point, this is the reason that Africa started to make itself independent, because the Africans felt ready to take charge of their own country and not just sit in the back and let the Europeans tell them what to do. One of those independent movements happened in Kenya, and in Kenya, the Kikuyu people, they were against British rule. They didn't want anybody to be in charge of them anymore, and so they started a political party to oppose it, to go against British rule and try and get themselves in a non-violent way free from being a British colony. Now, that wasn't going fast enough for people, and so they started a group called Mau Mau, and Mau Mau was a group that was violent. They used force, and what they thought is if we attack them and we fight, actually, it will end British rule much more quickly. And so they fought for many years. They fought for 4 years until they were able to get their independence in 1963. And in 1963, the person that they chose to lead their nation was the Kikuyu leader at the time, and his name was Jomo Kenyatta. All right, and Jomo Kenyatta took over the country, and over time, they started to industrialize to make themselves a richer nation. And again, industrialize means you're going to add factories. You want to add these machines and things like that that can help you to make your goods that you want to make. And so in adding factories, they needed people to work in those factories, so people moved from their farms in the rural area into cities, and cities became a big thing, as tends to happen in modern countries, right? And so it made them much richer, but it hurt those rural traditions where the people would be, or had these certain traditions of how they survived and how they farmed and did whatever else. Okay, it hurt those old traditions and kind of made the country, the people of the country, more similar. In South Africa, they gained their independence in 1910. However, in South Africa, the white minority kept the power. So the white people that were down there, that had moved down there, those original Boers and the people looking for gold and diamonds, they kept the power. And so in 1948, this white minority put a policy, an official government policy, into place called apartheid. And apartheid was a policy of keeping white and black South Africans apart. We've learned about this in American history, right? Segregation, keeping people separate. However, it doesn't work out because it's not equal. It's just separate, right? And so it was put into place again by the white minority, and it kept the power for the white South Africans. Okay, the South Africans were limited in almost everything they did. They were told where they can and cannot live. There were certain neighborhoods where black South Africans could live and certain where they couldn't. Okay, they were told where they could work and what kind of jobs they could do, so you didn't have this upward mobility to have these rich, high-paying jobs if you were black. Okay, they also had these really harsh laws that restricted whether or not they could travel even. They had separate education, separate schools, separate hospitals, not equal. Okay, much poorer hospitals, much worse schools, things like that. They were not allowed to vote if you were black, and you also were not allowed to marry anybody but another black person. And so any mixed marriages were made illegal in South Africa during apartheid. It was a very, very negative time, and it's seen as a negative thing from human rights aspect of the world's society. So final checkpoint, take some time to write out 3 questions that you have from the notes that you don't quite understand. If you don't have any questions, feel free to write 3 quick test questions that you might see on a quiz or a test. So apartheid did come to an end, and we're going to learn kind of how that happened. But it started off with the Black South Africans who were upset about it. They started to protest and create organizations to protest. And when they were out protesting, the white police responded with violence. And so again, it's a really bad thing. The world is looking at this and saying, man, this is really, really bad for human rights. This is not a positive thing at all. And so the government actually banned one of these groups called the African National Congress, the ANC. And so their political party, they were a political party that was working for black civil rights, but they weren't even allowed to be part of the government. And a lot of the leaders within this political party were thrown in jail. One of these leaders was Nelson Mandela. Some countries out there, all these different countries in the world who were concerned about this apartheid thing, they started to say, we're not going to trade with South Africa anymore. Okay, they're not treating their people right, so we're shutting them down. Okay, and that really did hurt South Africa's economy and was killing South Africa. That ANC leader that I talked about, Nelson Mandela, he was thrown into jail in 1962, but he didn't stop protesting. He continued to protest. He continued to speak out. He continued to write letters out of prison and try to protest apartheid and get it to come to an end. And so with his help, F.W. Clerk, the president, that's this man right here, okay, F.W. Clerk, he was a South African president from 1989 to 1994, and he saw that with all this trade issues, with people mad at each other, with violence from the police, this apartheid was destroying South Africa. It wasn't helping anybody. It wasn't helping the white people. It wasn't helping the black people. It wasn't helping anybody. It was tearing South Africa apart. And so what he did is in 1990, he released Nelson Mandela and brought the African National Congress back into politics and worked together with Nelson Mandela to end apartheid. And so apartheid ended, and in 1994, all of the people voted, and Nelson Mandela became the president. So Nelson Mandela was really a hero of this apartheid movement, and if he deserves all of the praise that he gets, but another hero of this apartheid movement was F.W. Clerk, the president who basically gave up his presidency and said, we're going to allow people that aren't going to vote for me to vote, and he did that to end this horrible policy.